What's up everyone, I'm Aldrich and welcome back to my Tree of Savior guide series. Today we are rounding off the basic archetype guides with the Wizard. The Wizard specializes in high damage AoE attacks over most of its classes, but there are definitely also some classes that focus more on support. In general though, no matter what classes you end up picking, there's no doubt that the Wizard is the most squishy archetype in the game. And they are also generally very reliant on abilities, because their auto attacks with rods and staves are just not that great. This specifically is a problem in the early game when you simply just don't have that many abilities yet and will be forced to use your auto attacks more often than you would later on. This of course also makes the Wizard a prime candidate for grouping, because it is probably the class that benefits most from having a healer and a tank. Now usually I only talk about rank 1 and 2, so the basic class Circle 1 and 2, and then the first two other classes that you can get at rank 2. However, with the Wizard I'm also going to talk about Wizard Circle 3. Reason being that Wizard Circle 3, unlike the Circle 3s of the other basic classes, is actually a real game changer. But we will get to that. Let's start by talking about the skills in Wizard Circle 1. The first Wizard skill is Energy Bolt, and Energy Bolt isn't that amazing damage-wise, but it is still not an awful ability. It is absolutely necessary that you pick this ability for the early game, because otherwise you will be saddled with just using your auto attacks, and seeing how there are plenty of wizard abilities that just aren't that good, it's totally fine to take points in Energy Bolt. The cool thing is that Energy Bolt has an attribute that gives it a sleep synergy, meaning if you sleep a target and then fire at that target with Energy Bolt will do quite a bit additional damage. And this additional damage actually makes Energy Bolt quite a hard-hitting ability later in the game. But then again, this is mostly something for when you're alone, because when you're in a group, the targets you sleep, you're not really going to shoot at them with Energy Bolt because you want them to remain sleeped. But it's still a pretty neat interaction that does result in quite a lot of damage from this ability. The next ability is Lethargy, and Lethargy is awful. Lethargy has a very small AoE, and the effect, while interesting early game, is completely and entirely insignificant later on. If you put 5 points into this, I think you can get something like 80 minus on physical attack and magical attack, which just does nothing at the higher levels where monsters have 3, 4, 5,000 physical and magical attack. And while the evasion portion may be useful in PvP, it really isn't either, because you're not taking off evasion percentages, you're taking off evasion points. And 10 evasion points don't really equal that many percentages. I think it's like 1 or 2 or 3% less evasion. It just isn't good enough. Sleep, on the other hand, is a pretty cool ability that puts a bunch of targets to sleep for a relatively short duration while you are on Wizard Circle 1. It even has a reasonably sized AoE, which means you can catch a bunch of enemies and put them to sleep. And this is great for a group situation, because you can pull a pack of monsters, sleep a couple of them, so you can focus damage on the others first if your group is a little bit lighter on AoE damage, and then have the others come in and deal with them. The next ability is Reflect Shield, and I do want to say that Reflect Shield actually affects the entire party. That isn't something that is really reflected in the tooltip, but it is actually the case. At early game, it is not an entirely bad ability, but the problem is that later on, it is absolutely pointless, because it reduces damage by so little and reflects so little damage that it's just not worth it. It does scale with Spirit, and the worst part is it scales with Spirit. There just are no wizard builds that really use a lot of Spirit. Sure, some Spirit here and there you can probably get away with, but just not in this case. And it's really not worth it anyway, because the skill isn't that great to begin with. And then lastly we have Earthquake, and Earthquake is a pretty cool AoE damage ability, because one, it is instant cast, so you don't really have to worry about long cast times or anything like that. It does relatively decent damage, but it's not overwhelming. It is, however, a pretty decent sized ability, and it juggles your enemies, which means they get knocked up into the air and then they bounce around on the floor a little bit, which actually adds up to quite a long crowd controlling effect. It also has a really cool interaction with the Ice Wall of the Cryomancer. Ice Wall from the Cryomancer freezes any enemy that comes into contact with it, and if you build the Ice Wall sort of underneath the enemy and they're on top of it, and you then Earthquake them, they will be knocked up into the air and then fall back down onto the Ice Wall, which will once again freeze them. And that is really cool because you can probably keep enemies out of combat for something like 12 seconds, and they are stunned, so you can actually punch and pummel them while they are bouncing around and getting frozen. Alright, now on to rank 2 as always, first with Wizard Circle 2. If you decide to go for Wizard Circle 2 by itself, then I would say you should go for 10 points in Sleep and 10 points in Earthquake right away. Because you only get one new skill on Wizard Circle 2, and that is Sure Spell. Sure Spell is a pretty good ability because it fixes one of the most annoying parts of the Wizard archetype, and that is interrupts. The Wizard archetype does have quite a lot of abilities that are cast time based, and in this game, if you get punched while you are casting a spell, you get interrupted pretty much all the time. And Sure Spell entirely fixes this problem and makes sure that while you are casting, you cannot be interrupted. The duration of Sure Spell also matches its cooldown, which is really great because you can technically have it up all the time. However, the actual duration is only something like 15 seconds, which does make it a little bit annoying to constantly have to reuse it for constant uptime. And then before we go to the other rank 2 classes, I want to talk about Wizard Circle 3 now. If you plan on going Wizard Circle 3, which I would recommend over Circle 2, so if you are going Circle 2, personally, I would also go for Circle 3 because the benefits of going Circle 2 just are not that great. They're at least not better than going Cryomancer or Pyromancer. So if you want a build that includes multiple circles of Wizard, you should absolutely aim for Circle 3. And if you do not increase Earthquake to 10 points. You leave it at 5 points as you had it on rank 1. Because we will need those additional 5 points. Beyond that, you raise Sleep to 15 points and Sure Spell to 10 points, because this makes Sure Spell's duration 25 seconds, and that is much more useful than any of the damage you would gain from putting a few extra points in Earthquake. Sleep at 15 points is also great, with the sleep then lasting about 17 seconds, which is a really long time in Tree of Savior terms. But now onto the absolute great reasons to get Wizard Circle 3. And the first one of these is Magic Missile. Magic Missile is an amazing AoE damage ability. It does have a pretty short cooldown and you can cast it twice, and it does an absolutely amazing amount of AoE damage in a reasonable range as well. And then there's of course also the fact that you can always cast Magic Missile at the darkness. And the second very good reason to get Wizard Circle 3 is Quick Cast. Probably by itself one of the most powerful abilities in this game. Because Quick Cast reduces your cast times by 50%, which is quite significant as there are a lot of abilities in the Wizard archetype that have rather long cast times, such as Meteor in Elementalist, which has about 5 or 6 seconds cast time. Halving that is pretty awesome. But that is not where the awesomeness of Quick Cast ends, because there is an attribute for Quick Cast that increases all your magic damage caused by 50% while Quick Cast is active. And the best thing about this, the duration is 1 second longer than the cooldown, so you actually have 50% increased magic damage at all times. The disadvantage of this overly powerful ability, of course, is that you have to recast it quite often. But it is still so damn good that Wizard Circle 3 is undoubtedly one of the biggest and best building blocks of a lot of the damage-focused Wizard builds. Now I will say, however, that leveling with Wizard Circle 3 is an absolute pain in the ass. The first 2 circles of it just don't do that much. You really get it for Circle 3 specifically, but because you have 2 ranks already that just didn't give you all that much power, you can't really dawdle around with stuff like Pyromancer and Cryomancer and really have to go for something incredibly strong like Sorcerer or Elementalist. And so because of this, you kind of have to go for Wizard Circle 3 right away on your first 3 ranks. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, let's go back to rank 2 and look at the first 2 different classes that the Wizard gets. The first of which is the Cryomancer. And the Cryomancer is a little bit more of a defensively focused class, while the Pyromancer is a little bit more aggressive. So the first ability the Cryomancer gets is Ice Bolt, and Ice Bolt is very similar to Energy Bolt in that it has a relatively low cooldown with 3 uses, the damage is a bit mediocre, but there is an attribute to make it really good, and that attribute increases its chance to freeze the target by 50%, which gives it a total freeze chance of about 60 to 65%, and that is of course very significant. It's another great and reliable way to freeze targets at range, which otherwise isn't that easy. The second ability is the meat and potatoes of Cryomancer. It is Ice Pike. Ice Pike is a great AoE damage ability that does actually do quite a lot of damage and has a very high freeze chance that pretty much always freezes the target. The disadvantage of Ice Pike, however, is that it is a line AoE, so it blooms in front of you and takes a while to reach the full distance as well. And in general, it's just not that long range, so you have to be very, very close to the actual targets, making it more likely that you will be bopped in the face. But the best thing about Ice Pike, and what probably makes Cryomancer not an entirely awful pain in the ass to level, is that Ice Pike does an insane amount of damage to bosses. And then next we have Ice Wall. And Ice Wall is just as awesome as Ice Pike, but in a different way. It is a great AoE damage ability that does have quite a significant cooldown for a rank 2 ability. However, it is also high in utility and defensive ability because you can choose how the wall actually is built. If you just click the ability, it will go in a straight line in front of you, but you can also hold it and then with the arrow buttons or with the arrow pad on your controller, I believe, decide where the next field of the ice wall should be. So if you have enough points in Ice Wall, you can build the ice wall around yourself to protect yourself from attacks. Or you can close off a section to block monsters from coming through it for a while. There are so many uses with Ice Wall, I really wish it had a shorter cooldown, because I would be using this thing all the time on my Cryomancer. And then lastly we have Ice Blast, and Ice Blast only does damage to frozen targets. So when you use it while there's no frozen targets, your character just snaps their fingers and nothing happens. This of course makes the ability a little bit situational because you first need frozen targets from one of your other abilities. However, if you do have frozen targets, then this is a really good AoE damage ability because it practically hits all frozen targets in range. Alright, now on to the Pyromancer, and as I said, Pyromancer is quite a bit more of an offensive class than Cryomancer. The first ability is Fireball, and Fireball is definitely not what you think. If you've ever played any other MMOs, then you think of Fireball as you target someone and you throw a fireball and it's a ranged ability. In this game, that is not the case. The fireball that you cast is a little ball that you put right in front of you on the ground. And it's immovable as well, so you have to put it where monsters already are or then pull them into it. It does pretty okay damage once you invest a couple of points into it, but the AoE is rather smallish, and again it is melee ranged, so that makes it a little harder to use in some group situations. Overall though, it's not a bad ability and it can definitely do some significant damage. Next we have Firewall, and Firewall is pretty similar to Ice Wall, just with fire, which also means that it really doesn't block enemy movement, and that is one of the things that's so good about Ice Wall. The other problem is that Ice Wall gets one additional field for every point you invest into it, so at 15 ranks you get 15 fields of Ice Wall, which is a really damn long Ice Wall. With Firewall you get a much more reasonable amount of fields, and as such I just don't feel that Firewall is all that great, to be honest. It does have some interesting attributes that give fire property buffs to your group mates, but it only really lasts for 5 seconds. All in all, I just don't think the ability is quite worth it. Next we have Enchant to Fire, which is a pretty decent group buffing ability early on in the game. However, just like Sacrament, it kind of loses out a little bit on its significance later on in the game. I don't necessarily think you have to skip Enchant Fire. I think if you really want it for the early game, you're playing with a buddy or something, or you want to make it a little bit easier on yourself with the auto attacks, then put 2 points in Enchant Fire. I don't really think it's going to detract all that much from your class. But as I said, it does become pretty useless later on, and the duration only matches the cooldown if you invest 5 points into it. Next we have Flare, and Flare is very similar to Ice Blast and Cryomancer in that it only works on burning targets. However, there are not as many sources to get people set on fire in Pyromancer as there are freeze abilities in Cryomancer. There's an attribute for Fireball that adds the chance for a burning effect on that, but other than that only Flame Ground actually sets targets on fire. But when targets are on fire, it is a significant AoE ability just like Ice Blast. And so I would either go 5 points here, or if you did invest 2 points in Enchant Fire, then only invest 3 points into Flare, because it is the most situational ability in the class. And then lastly we have Flame Ground, and this is probably the best ability if you just go for Pyromancer Circle 1. Because it does really good continuous AoE damage, has a decently short cooldown, counts as a burn effect for Flare, but it also remains significant up until way later in the game, and has also a reasonably sized AoE. Alright boys and girls, that is all about the class's skills. Now let's talk about leveling. As I already said earlier, leveling early game is a little bit annoying with the wizard archetype because of your weak auto attacks. But as soon as you start getting some abilities from your classes, it gets easier and easier. However, your SP consumption is always going to be somewhat of a worry, so be prepared and have enough SP potions with you. You're always going to need those stupid things, and also bring some firewood with you so you can make some bonfires to regenerate that mana back up without using one of the expensive mana potions. Apart from that, if you're going to level by yourself, stick to questing. It is not really worth it grinding with a wizard in Tented Garden unless you actually get a group. Because you have so few abilities, you would be forced to use a lot of auto attacks there, and you're just not gonna be fast enough to make the grinding worth it. Also be aware that there are a lot of wizard abilities that are on the ground, so they don't affect flyers. It's not all of these abilities, but some of them definitely are. And as I also said earlier, if you really want to go for Wizard Circle 3, remember that your first about 80 levels are going to be a little bit shit. Alright, now let's go quickly over the attribute priority. For Wizard Circle 1, the first thing you want to get is the Energy Bolt Extra Sleep Damage. That wonderful little synergy with sleep does make Energy Bolt quite powerful, and so you should get that first. Secondly, I would go for Energy Bolt Enhance, because it does make the ability a little bit more useful until you get those high amounts of magic attack later in the game when it starts being okay-ish again. Then get Earthquake Enhance, because you're gonna use it all throughout your career, and why not? And then lastly, Cloth Mastery Magic. You absolutely want to be wearing robes as a wizard, and Cloth Mastery Magic gives you more SP, gives you more magic defense, so buy points in this because it's good. If you go for Wizard Circle 2, there is not a single damn attribute that you need to pick up that you haven't already picked up in Wizard Circle 1 except for Weapon Swap. But if you go for Wizard Circle 3, obviously the first thing you want to get is Quick Cast Magic Damage, because this attribute is the entire reason why you went Circle 3 in the first place. And then after that, Magic Missile Enhance, because that ability does so much freaking damage that having it do even more freaking damage is just sensible. If you choose for the Cryomancer on rank 2, the first thing you should get is Ice Bolt Increased Freeze Chance, because having that ability around to freeze a target at range whenever you need it is just a boon. Then you should go for Rod Mastery Ice, because as a Cryomancer you are going to need every little bit of help you can when it comes to dealing continuous damage, and so dealing a little bit more damage with your Rod, that's just fine. Then you should get Shield Mastery Enchant, simply because it's only a couple of points and it's quite a good ability as well. Ice Blast additional damage against leather is something I do pick up because there are quite a lot of monsters that actually have the leather armor type. And then as always at the end you pick up all the 100 rank enhance attributes for Ice Pike, Ice Bolt and Ice Blast so that those abilities keep doing damage at the higher tiers. For the Pyromancer, the first thing you want to pick up is Fireball Burn, because you want that fireball to set people on fire so you can use your flare ability. Next we're going to go for Flare Extra Damage. There are not quite as many mobs with the cloth armor type as there are with the leather armor type, but it is still a pretty good thing, and it's just a couple of thousand silver, it's worth it. Then we're going to pick up Staff Mastery Fire. Hopefully as the Pyromancer we're not going to use our staff all that much, but whenever we do it's good to have this ability rockin'. Then before anything else we want to get Flame Ground Enhance, because this is our main damaging ability as a Pyromancer. And it's so good that we want to enhance it first. Then we enhance the Fireball because it's the second best ability, and the Flare, being a little bit more situational, is the third one we enhance. And then lastly, if you did decide to go for Enchant to Fire, then you should pick up Enchant Fire Resist debuff, and you could probably pick that up before you go for all of the enhance abilities. Alright guys, and that is it for the Wizard archetype, and by extension for the basic archetype guides. Phew, because I really want to move on to some other guides. Don't worry, there's still a lot of stuff to come for Tree of Savior, because Tree of Savior actually has a lot of things that do warrant explaining. So keep an eye on my channel for more Tree of Savior guides and other MMO related content. But until then, I've been the Cloaking Donkey, and I'll see you in another video.